and about 230,000 in Orange County. And for the, I wish we had the 2014 data, but we have the 2012 data, and we know that 72% of all registered voters voted, but for Asian American voters, it's at about 65%. I would love to see the PDI data, to see that spreadsheet that he handed out earlier, to see what it says about Asian Americans on his data. You probably have access to that. So that's the population. In the way that we've approached our work in doing Asian American voter outreach and engagement is we look at the community as if there are barriers to the voting process. So the first one, this is very similar to some of the things that Rosalind mentioned, is access to information. So our Asian American and Pacific Islander voters here in LA, they don't have access to information. They don't know that there's an election going on. They don't know who they're voting for. Most of them, a lot of them are immigrants, so they're coming from countries where they don't have a basic understanding of democracy. And their ideas of what voting is very different from the home country that they're coming from. Also, the information that they have access, they don't have access to in-culture information. So I think a lot of depending on what country a lot of these Asian American immigrants are coming from, their relationship to democracy is really different. The second one is the access to mechanics to voting. They really just don't know how to vote. They don't know how to pull the lever. They don't know where the polling place is. So that's number two. The third one is access to engagement. This is very similar to the early morning conversation because most campaigns only focus on the swing voters or the 5-5 voters like Kathy was mentioning. The voters that we're dealing with are the low propensity voters, or the ones that are often ignored from the voting process. And then you get into this catch-22 situation where these communities aren't being engaged in the process because they're not turning out to vote, and then because they're not turning out to vote, they're not being engaged in the process. So because of this, there's a lack of engagement. A lot of the communities that we work with are also not involved in rallies or forums, and that's also a form of engagement that's needed for the community. And the final two are, the next one is access to in-language resources. Which is obviously very difficult. It's a lot different than having one language, Spanish, or in the API community, we have to do 17 languages. I know LA County provides in-language resources, but in a lot of these communities, because they don't meet the threshold level, we have to create these in-language resources ourselves. And in addition to the in-language resources, we also have to do in-culture resources. There's a lot of different ways of dealing with communities, such as the Vietnamese community really relies heavily on radio media, or the South Asian community really relies heavily on print media. So depending on which community you're dealing with, you have to shift your outreach strategy. So we have to understand all that in all 17 communities that we're working with. And then finally, it's just the access to the protection of voting rights, which is a lot of the work that we've been doing at Advancing Justice. So I mean, just basically our strategy in dealing with how we engage the Asian American community is, like was mentioned earlier, is micro-targeting these communities, figuring out what their needs are, and just going in really laser-pointed with multilingual and cultural tactics. And then the second one is to really focus on low propensity voters and develop this habit of voting so that we can shift the culture of voting and make it easier for people to vote and turn out to vote, and it becomes normal and regular. And some of the ways that we do this, our main strategy is doing phone banking, mainly because the Asian American community is so diverse and we don't all live in particular areas. So phone banking, getting on the phones, is the easiest way to work with them. We partner with 13 different this past fall we partnered with 13, but we partner with many more organizations, but we partner with community organizations that are in the community. They are our best leaders to reach out to the community. We try to create resources that are in language and in cultures. Of the people that we called this fall, 80% said they were going to vote or they had already voted, which is, we don't have the data yet to see if they actually did vote, but I think compared to the data that did come out of people, of the amount of people that voted, I think this kind of shows that when you talk to people in their language, using people from their community, that it does make a difference in getting Asian Americans out to vote. Some recommendations, I think there was a lot of great recommendations that were mentioned today. The first one would be to address issues that are important to the Asian American community. I think this is something that that would draw people out. We incorporate a lot of issue surveys in how we talk to the community. And we know that education, healthcare, and budget are the top issues for the Asian American community that we work with. It's important to target civic engagement efforts specifically for the API community. And one of the things that was mentioned earlier, I believe, was it's very difficult to figure out who's the Malaysian-speaking voter, who's the Burmese-speaking voter, because the voter file doesn't have that data. So if there's a way to develop ethnic or race identifiers in the voter file, it would make it a lot easier for us. I know that the voter registration process requests people to, if people have in-language needs, they can mark that, but I don't have access to that in the voter file that I am allowed to have because of the laws that are in place. So if there's some way that for our community groups to be able to understand what are the ethnicities of the people that are voting and what are the language needs of the people that are voting, that would make a huge difference to being able to get these particular communities out to vote. The online voter registration process was a huge step, especially in being able to have all the multiple languages, specifically the API languages that are on. Now it's just the next step of making sure that that website gets onto all the websites of API media that exist out there. Yeah, and the use of Asian American ethnic media is also important, using and community leaders to be our navigators when it comes to shifting the culture of civic engagement within the community. When we were making our phone calls this past in June, I think we were asking a lot of our voters, did you get your sample ballot? Do you need resources in language? And I think a lot of people didn't even know that in language resources were available to them. So I know that that's available through the county, but if there's a way to make it easier for the voters to know that those resources exist, and we are a great resource for that as nonprofits, but if there's a way to make that connection to be stronger, that would be a lot better for our community that really relies on in-language materials. Finally, there's been a lot of talk about vote-by-mail conversion. I found it really fascinating when Rosalind was saying the Latino community doesn't turn out as high in a number. The Asian American community turns out in very high numbers when it comes to the vote-by-mail process. They turn out, according to a report that we have from 2008, I think it's something like 40% of the, well, I can send it to you later, but something like 40% of the people that are vote by mail turn out by vote by mail. I'm not quite sure what the statistics are, but I can give that to you later.
Yeah, what's interesting is, I mean, you asked about the PDI data. While the overall turnout by ethnicity on these charts for LA County was 26% for Asians, 23% for Latinos, 26% for African Americans, with regards to vote by mail, it was 26% for Latinos and 54% for Asians. And in fact, statewide, that number is as high as 76% for Asians. Though interestingly, 60% for Latinos. An enormous gap between LA and the rest of the state in terms of Latino vote by mail. So it's interesting. I mean, maybe the vote by mail phenomenon is not particular to Latinos. Maybe it's something to do with the stories that we heard about with regards to LA. But anyway, there we go. Carry on.
Oh, yeah. Finally, I just wanted to close out my recommendations. I would say that just having in-language assistance is really important. And like I was saying, there are voting materials that are provided that are in language for some of the Asian languages, but the website is a little bit difficult to navigate for the community. So if that could be easier, that would be helpful. I know there's a concerted effort to have bilingual poll workers speaking, and we are involved with the process of recruiting people to speak those languages at the polls, but that is something that we need to continue to work on and to close that gap there.
Okay, thank you. And I know that Dean Logan's here listening and taking furious notes, so he's been listening very carefully. Well, thank you so much.